Up to 1941, Hess was Hitler's loyal deputy, a devoted, fanatical follower of the Führer. Then, in May 1941, he suddenly acted, as it seemed, totally out of character. Got into a Messerschmitt, flew to Britain, announced that he had come to negotiate peace. Throughout human history, there's been an incurable tendency to explain bizarre events like this, not as what we now call cock-ups, the product of human incompetence or eccentricity, but as conspiracies. History, of course, records many real conspiracies. Conspiracy theorists, however, tend to construct imaginary conspiracies, both more complex and better concealed than any real conspiracy ever was.
There's no dispute about Hesse's early life. He was born at Alexandria, Egypt, in 1894, the son of a wealthy German merchant. In his teens, he traveled to Europe to complete his education. On the outbreak of war, Hess joined the 1st Bavarian Infantry Regiment and gained a reputation for almost reckless bravery. In the summer of 1917, he was shot in the chest while fighting in Romania. When he came out of hospital, he left the infantry and trained as a fighter pilot. After the war, Hess was one of the first to see Adolf Hitler as Germany's Messiah. Following the failed Nazi putsch in November 1923, he spent a year with Hitler in Landsberg prison. Hitler dictated to him the text of Mein Kampf, the racist Bible of the Nazi Party. On Saturday evenings, Hess gathered with other prisoners as Hitler read the completed chapters to them. After they left prison late in 1924, Hess was rarely far from the Führer's side. When Hitler became dictator in 1933, he made Hess deputy Führer. Hess introduced Hitler at mass meetings with the fanatical fervor of the true believer in the Nazi racist millennium.
Mein Führer, Sie stehen die Fahnen und Standarten dieses Nationalsozialismus. Wenn Sie richten, richtet das Volk. Sie waren uns der Garant des Sieges. Sie sind uns der Garant des Friedens. Adolf Hitler! Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil! Die Partei ist Hitler! Hitler aber ist Deutschland, wie Deutschland Hitler ist! Hitler, Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil!
Away from the public platform, Hess slipped into the background, taking an increasingly ceremonial role while policy was decided without him. After the early victories of the Second World War, Hess decided at long last to strike out on his own. He devised an eccentric plan to take the British out of the war. He would fly to Britain and persuade them to make peace. On the 10th of May, 1941, he prepared to take off in a Messerschmitt.
He had lunch. I was a little bit ill, and he had lunch alone and came upstairs and had a cup of tea with me. And then he went in the room of the boy. He was only nearly, not quite 3 years, and said goodbye to the boy. And when he came back, he was very, very serious. And I was a little bit suspicious, and I asked him, when will you be back? He said, oh, I'll have a plane flying this afternoon in Augsburg, and then I'm going with the train to Berlin. I think I'll be back on Monday. And I looked at him and said, I don't think that you will be back on Monday. And afterwards, he has told, I believe Dr. Seidel in Nuremberg, that he just was startled, because at this moment he thought, does she know anything? Or has she a suspicion? I had none. I only thought he won't be back on Monday.
On the 10th of May 1941, he went with his adjutant to the aircraft. He started the engine. The aircraft was checked for full load. After he reduced the power, he asked for the chocks to be taken away. He started. That means he went onto the runway and started, and he went away somewhere. We don't know where, but he didn't return.
His name is David McClay. He works on a farm not far from Glasgow. He saw Rudolf Hess coming down in the darkness by parachute. But let him tell you his own story.
Yes, I'm the man that captured Rudolf Hess. Little did I realise at the time the important man he turned out to be. I helped him to his feet and into the cottage, where we made tea, but the man refused tea and would only have a drink of water.
Soon afterwards, Hess was interrogated by Captain Donald of the Royal Observer Corps.
I asked him for his autograph. So he gave me an autograph, which he did write rather laboriously and carefully, signing himself as Alfred Horn. And I looked at it admiringly, and it's in very interesting initials. A.H., just the same as Adolf Hitler. He didn't look a bit amused. He looked, if anything, rather peevish or fierce, rather. And then I said, but Alfred, surely. Alfred's not a very Germanic name. It's Anglo-Saxon. Oh, surely Germanic was a very Germanic name. Very Germanic. But I said, Anglo-Saxon. In Anglo-Saxon, it really means Alf the Red. In German, it should surely be Rudolf or Rudolf. Well, I could see he was really worried. In fact, I knew that he knew that he'd been spotted, I think. I'm almost sure of that. And I didn't want to... I wanted to put him out of his misery. So I just told him to stand up, stehen Sie auf. And after I just passed the hint to the Home Guard what I was going to say, I just said to him, I will now pass in my reports and your message to the Duke of Hamilton tonight and tell him that you give your name as Hauptmann Alfred Horn, but that I know your correct name is Rudolf Hess, the Deputy Führer of the German Reich.
In the days which followed, Hess declared the flight was his own idea and that he'd planned to contact members of a peace movement to oust Churchill's government.
Hess's behaviour after his crash landing provided evidence for both conspiracy and cock-up theorists. On the one hand, his grandiose suggestion of peace negotiations between Britain and Germany raised the suspicion of some sort of plot between British appeasers and the Nazis. On the other hand, the fact that his pockets were bulging with a bizarre variety of patent medicines, which he enthusiastically recommended to the doctor who examined him, suggested that he might be mentally unbalanced.
Hess was moved to Mitchett Place, Aldershot, where he was given the codename Z. Mitchett Place became Camp Z, and he was guarded by Secret Service officers. The Lord Chancellor, Lord Simon, paid him a visit. A news blackout was ordered.
Few things encourage conspiracy theory as effectively as official secrecy. There's a tendency to believe that behind every official secret lurks an official cover-up. The long drawn-out government secrecy in the handling of Rudolf Hess is a prime example. In June 1942, Hess was moved again to yet another secret location, this time to Mendiff Court Hospital near Abergavenny.
The news blackout was less effective than before, but photographs of Hess were still forbidden. There was still quite enough mystery about Hess's stay here to encourage conspiracy theories to develop.
In fact, there was no real government conspiracy. The government simply wasn't interested in Hess's suggestions of a compromised peace. What the government did quite reasonably hope, however, was that the Führer's deputy would have access to Hitler's war secrets. The main point of surrounding Hess with secret servicemen, and sending Lord Simon to interview him at Mitchett was to extract those secrets from him. From the moment that the government discovered that Hitler had not taken Hess into his confidence, it lost much of its interest in Hess. Hess's bizarre behavior here at Mendiff Court lent weight to the suggestion that he was mentally unbalanced. Hess accused the authorities of maliciously interfering with his food, with his radio, even with his socks, and he stabbed himself in an unconvincing suicide attempt. Hess was kept here for the last 3 years of the war, ready to be arraigned as a war criminal at the Nuremberg Trials.
Hess was among the 21 leading Nazis tried at Nuremberg by a panel of 4 judges from Britain, France, the United States and the Soviet Union. Hess's behavior in the dock alternated between apparent derangement and composure. Goering told the prison psychiatrist, "His memory has definitely gone, and I don't believe any longer that he was faking in the first place. He even admitted a couple of weeks ago that he really suffered amnesia in England, and said it wasn't all fake here either, just as you always said." God, what a farce it's going to be when he gets up to testify. Hess's closing speech was rambling and sometimes bizarre. He paid a passionate tribute to Hitler as the greatest son my country has brought forth in 1,000 years.
Einstehend anzusehen. Zwischenfügen möchte ich noch hinsichtlich meines Eides. Ich bin kein
His rambling statement went on and on until Mr. Justice Lawrence called a halt.
Rat bei mir.
I must draw the attention of the defendant, Hess, to the fact that he has already spoken for 20 minutes, and the tribunal has indicated to the defendants that they cannot allow them to continue to make statements of great length at this stage of the proceedings.
11 of the defendants were sentenced to death, 7 to imprisonment. 3 were acquitted.
Defendant Rudolf Hess. The tribunal sentences you to imprisonment for life.
Those war criminals served their sentences in Spandau Jail, Berlin. Hess and his 6 companions were now the only prisoners guarded in turn by troops from the 4 powers who had put them on trial. As the years went by, the world slowly forgot about the Nazi war criminals. Until 1969, Hess refused visits from his family. Officially, he was prisoner number 7. By 1966, however, he was the only inmate kept in the West Berlin prison at the insistence of the Soviet Union. Then in 1973 came the first whisper that the man in Spandau might not be Rudolf Hess. Hugh Thomas had been appointed consultant surgeon to the British military hospital in Berlin. When he had a chance to examine Hess, he was astonished by the absence of chest wounds from the First World War.
Reference to various records, etc., no one had actually pulled the original war records, which, funnily enough, were in Berlin, not too far from where I was at the time. When I found the original documentation, it denoted he'd had a Durchschuss by a rifle bullet. A Durchschuss is a through shot, in other words, a penetrating wound going straight through the lung. Now, I didn't know the exact site at that time from those particular records, but what I did know was that any rifle bullet wound caused in the First World War would, going through the chest, have instantly caused an entrance wound of about 1 inch to 1.5 inches as a minimum. The old-fashioned bullets were very effective. And also an exit wound, which would have been in the region of about 2.5 inches in diameter, presuming he'd been shot at close range as the record suggested. As well as that, I expected to find from Saarbruch's from reference to Sauerbruch, a 20 to 30 centimetre scar in the chest from front to back, because it was his wont to actually open the wound widely, open the chest widely, also to remove the rib as opposed to just separate the ribs. We know from the letters that I didn't then, but I have subsequently discovered, the letters of the real Rudolf Hess to his parents and to others, that he gave a very accurate description of how he was shot and where he was shot. He said the bullet entered his chest 2 inches below his left shoulder, which would be in the rough area of the 3rd to 4th rib or 2nd to 3rd interspace, exactly as I expected, and that it exited below the left scapula, which again would be exactly as I expected. So you'd expect to see an entrance wound here, a very ugly exit wound in the back of the chest below the scapula, and a thoracotomy scar to match alongside from front to back. As I said, none of these wounds were present.
Hugh Thomas's book, Hess, A Tale of Two Murders, has attracted worldwide media attention. The medical evidence, it argues, proves that prisoner number 7 could not be Rudolf Hess. A bogus Hess, Thomas believes, first appeared on the scene on the 10th of May, 1941. The plane in which Hess took off, Thomas argues, was replaced after it left Germany by a different plane with a different pilot.
I don't believe on the data we have to date on the plane that took off that it can be matched with the plane that landed on the type, the number, nor the free will capacity and capability.
A good conspiracy theorist usually attracts support. Hugh Thomas's theory is backed by the aviation expert Douglas McRoberts. Like Thomas, McRoberts believes both that there's been a cover-up and that there must have been 2 planes.
2 aircraft were necessary because 1 aircraft couldn't make the flight which was claimed. We know that because aviation colleagues of mine contacted the Messerschmitt's factory. They provided us with the full operational capability of this aircraft with only 1 man on board and all the external tanks and so on. It was only afterwards when we got back to them and said 876 miles maximum range cannot explain the Hess flight that several strange things happened. They then said they couldn't provide any photographs of the Hess aircraft, which they had done in the past. They said that it was possible for the Hess aircraft to actually get to Glasgow in a straight line, although that's not the flight plan the pilot claimed.
If Douglas McRoberts is right about the range and identification of the Messerschmitt in which Hess took off, then another Messerschmitt must have replaced it at some point during the flight to Scotland. And if the plane was changed, the possibility arises that the pilot was changed too. As with most conspiracy theories, however, the theory that a bogus Hess was switched for the real Hess in mid-flight depends on highly controversial evidence. Mr. McRoberts' views are disputed by other aviation experts. One of those best placed to know the truth about the Messerschmitt was Helmut Carden, assistant manager at the airfield where Hess took off.
After Rudolf Hess had trained himself on the Me-110, he once noticed when I was flying an Me-110, which had extra fuel tanks. The normal equipment for an Me-110 was 1,200 litres of fuel, and at that time we fixed under the wing to the left and to the right 2 extra containers which could carry 900 litres each. So the complete capacity of the air fuel was increased to 3,000 litres. With those 3,000 litres, it would have been possible to stay airborne for 10 hours, which would have been equivalent to a distance far more than going to England and back.
The number of the plane that took off on that May Day in 1941 was fairly clearly established up until before I wrote the book as being NJ or NJC-11, Balkenkreuz, a cross in the middle. That plane was on the Augsburg books. That plane was recorded as being modified in that a radio was put in, and you can see the actual modification requests in the actual data at the factory. The plane that landed in Scotland or crashed, we're not certain as to whether one occurred or the other, but certainly the plane that ended up in Scotland was clearly marked VJ Balkan Cross OQ. The V could have been, is only a delivery call sign, could have been made into an N later, but the fuselage in any case has been slightly painted since. But the fuselage is still available for people to see. Now that number was not appreciated by Messerschmitts even after the war, because they thought that there was no record that the actual fuselage had been destroyed.
This is the fuselage, and here is one of the engines of the plane which crash-landed in Scotland. The letters V, J, O, Q are clearly visible, and the works number, 3869, appears on the other side. Helmut Carden is positive that these were the markings which appeared on the Messerschmitt on which Hess took off from Germany.
Each time Hess wanted to fly his aircraft, I would fly it for a short time to check that it was technically perfect. In my logbook, I have some of the flights noted. On the 29th of March 1941, I flew the VJOQ. Again, on the 29th of March, there was another flight done by me. That was the second flight. The third flight was on the 30th of April. That was before he sat in the aircraft and got out again. Then I flew the aircraft once again on the 6th of May 1941. Those flights are all noted in my book.
It now seems clear that the plane which landed in Scotland was the plane which took off from Germany. But what about the pilot? Well, there's now a whole range of evidence, much of it new, to help us establish whether the man who landed in Scotland and later died in Spandau was or was not Rudolf Hess. In addition to medical records, there are the recollections of those who knew the prisoner in Spandau. There's photographic evidence, and there are the results of voice analysis. First, the evidence of Hess's family. His son, Wolf Rüdiger Hess, was too young in 1941 to remember his father then. But he's convinced by what his mother remembers.
Die Familie hat immer die Meinung vertreten, dass es sich bei dem Mann in Spandau Rudolf Hess handelt. Und zwar gründete sie diese Ansicht auf die Aussage meiner Mutter, dass es unmöglich ist, meiner Mutter ein Double vorzusetzen. Und das haben wir seit Jahren, seit die Theorie von Thomas existiert, immer wieder betont.
We did indeed spend a lot of time talking about his family. It was a major topic of conversation. When I came to visit him, Hess had received letters from his family. Sometimes he showed them to me. He also showed me photos of his grandchildren. Because during the first year I was in Berlin, his first grandchild was born, a girl. He had 3 grandchildren, and he was very interested in their activities and everything about them. He was also very preoccupied with what his son was up to, his movements. He was especially concerned about his wife, who lived alone in a small mountain town in Bavaria. He showed a lot of concern for his loved ones. He always worried a lot about his family. Therefore, I think one could not, without great difficulty, play a part like that for so many years. Hess was extremely familiar with the circumstances of his family, past and present. I think his family did recognize him as Rudolf Hess.
Modern techniques of voice analysis also undermine Hugh Thomas's theory.
That was the voice of Rudolf Hess, recorded speaking at a Nazi party rally in 1937 in Nuremberg. Now listen to the voice of the man who was tried at Nuremberg in 1946.
Ich habe diese Voraussagen aber nicht nur hier zu Beginn des Prozesses gesagt und gemacht, sondern bereits Monate.
One of the things that I compared in looking at these 2 voice samples was the pitch height. In other words, how high or how low a speaking voice the people had. And what's quite clear is that the Nuremberg rally sample has a very distinctively high pitch. It's around about 206 vibrations of the vocal cords per second, which is very, very high for a male speaker of Hesse's age. Interestingly, the sample from the Nuremberg trial had a similarly high pitch range, on average 203 vocal cords vibrations per second. In other words, there was less than one semitone between the two samples, the difference. Also, that pitch range, 205 vibrations of the vocal cords per second, is very, very unusual among male speakers. Most male speakers of that age range have a vocal cord vibration rate of about 105 times per second rather than 205. So if the average German speaker was here, Hess and the man who went to Spandau were.
The theory of a bogus Hess is also undermined by photographic evidence.
Here is a photograph of the man in Spandau prison, and all I've done is to lay a piece of tracing paper over it and just draw some lines from specific points, the point of the chin and up to the lateral borders of the eye sockets. And you can see I've marked where the bottom of the nose is and where the mouth comes. So now it's a matter of comparing this triangulation with a photograph which we know definitely is that of Hess. So bring this one over. If I put the triangulation on that, you can see that it is way out, and that's because this photograph is not of exactly the same scale. And to achieve that, I made a tracing which has reduced the features slightly so that the nose is exactly the same size as the nose of the older man. And if we put the triangulation on here, we can see that in the vertical plane, the features are the same. The point of the chin, the mouth, the nose, the bridge of the nose. So we now established that apart from sort of general spatial relationship, there are measurements which also are similar.
The third thing I examined was the pronunciation of the vowel and the consonant sounds in each of the samples. This element of the research was undertaken in conjunction with Dr. Peter Auer of the Department of Sprachenwissenschaft at the University of Konstanz in West Germany. Dr. Auer's a dialectologist who's done considerable work on southern German accents, on the Bavarian accent in particular, and this was invaluable in the research in that what we look for at this point are personal peculiarities of pronunciation, idiosyncratic ways of speaking. Obviously, to know what's a personal peculiarity, one must first know what the norm is for the accent in question, and that's where Dr. Auer's contribution came in. What we found was that both Hess, speaking at the Nuremberg rally, and the person speaking at the Nuremberg trial had exactly the same distinctive mixture of southern German Bavarian-type vowels and consonants and high or standard German ones. In addition to that, there were certain individual peculiarities of pronunciation. For example, the I vowel in words like Deutschland, rather than the tongue having a back starting point for the production of it, the tongue was in a more advanced position in the mouth. Deutschland rather than Deutschland.
Intriguing little point is the form of the lower lip. You can see that sort of little mark there and this dimpling. And that's echoed again there. And moving up slightly, we come to the philtrum between the nose and the mouth, and in all cases it appears to be across to the right. One can't really ascertain it on this because the photograph is far too indistinct, but certainly on this one you can. We'll move on to the ears, which are particularly interesting, and if we have a look at the photograph, the Spandau photograph, we can see that the ears, they are lobeless. Here the ear just floats straight the way down, and there is a pronounced tragus. Unfortunately, we can't look at the lateral view of the head because the photograph really of the ear there is far too indistinct. But if we look at some of the other photographs of those which are known to be Hess, we can see this similarity coming up again and again, the ear drifting straight the way down into the side of the face. There is no sort of separate lobe there. So that is another feature which is consistent between the photographs that we know are those of Hess and the photographs which are in question.
It's my view, and also that of Dr. Auer at the University of Constance, that it would be a very, very remote chance that we would find two people who just coincidentally had these speech patterns. As I've said, a number of the features we've identified are personal, idiosyncratic features. Also, a lot of them are quite subtle. They're not the sort of things that would easily lend themselves to mimicry or to imitation. In short, looking at the evidence overall, taking all the facts into consideration, it's our firm view that the person speaking at the Nuremberg trial is also the person who spoke on the earlier recordings, the Nuremberg rally.
And again, with the folds and wrinkles under the eyes, and these are very difficult to pick out, but there's the bottom eyelid. And then you have 1, 2, coming into there, and 3. And you have a small one there, coming in there, 2 and 3. Now, these are very, very particular details, which, again, I don't think one could say 100% that they would never be similar or the same on another person. But I would hazard that with so many features identical in each case, the chances of this individual not being the same as that are so slight as to be dismissed.
Hugh Thomas subtitles his book A Tale of Two Murders. The real Hess, he believes, was killed in 1941, and the bogus Hess murdered in 1987. And no sooner had the bogus Hess been murdered than Spandau prison was destroyed, along with much of the evidence.
Hess's death in prison at the age of 93 immediately added to the conspiracy theory surrounding his life. On the 17th of August 1987, he was found dead in Spandau with an electric flex around his neck. The official verdict was suicide, but there were inevitably those who doubted whether a feeble 93-year-old man could really have killed himself.
But if prisoner number 7 in Spandau was murdered, what was the motive?
It would seem that there was a genuine offer by Gorbachev to release the prisoner, Perestroika and Glasnost at work. The prisoner himself became very morose when he knew about this and said to his warders and others that he didn't expect to see daylight, he didn't expect to be released and survive. So obviously he was aware himself of a danger to himself, which proved fatally correct in the long term. In the short term, I think that for the British, and I believe it was the British that caused the murder, to allow his release would have meant detailing the exact nature of his interposition into the Hess conspiracy and into really what happened. In other words, details would have been forthcoming about the hierarchical influence in Britain, what really was going on between the Germans and the British, what peace negotiations were being contemplated. I think his role in all this was too dangerous to allow to surface.
The unexpected, dramatic death of the famous, whether statesmen like John F. Kennedy or media stars like Marilyn Monroe, invariably give rise to conspiracy theory. In the case of Rudolf Hess, the confused official explanation for his death, the muddle surrounding the autopsy, the almost instantaneous destruction of the prison, fueled conspiracy theory further by suggesting that the authorities had something to hide.
The official autopsy by Professor J.M. Cameron, which gave a verdict of suicide, was rejected by Hess's family, which sought a second opinion from Dr. Wolf Spann. He later expressed surprise that marks on Hess's neck had been barely mentioned.
We were astonished by that and asked ourselves whether these marks might have been absent at the time of the first autopsy. But we came to the conclusion that because of the way they were sustained, not only must they have been there at the time of the first autopsy, they must have been observed then too. They simply weren't recorded.
We showed both autopsy reports to Bernard Knight, Professor of Pathology at the Wales Institute of Forensic Medicine, and asked him how such discrepancies could arise.
Professor Cameron notes that on the left side of the neck was a fine linear mark, being more apparent when viewed in ultraviolet light. So all he described is a mark on the neck. He doesn't say which direction it ran or much about it. Whereas Professor Spann, who did a post-mortem a day or so later, has a much greater description of a mark which virtually goes right round the neck as far as we can make out, certainly across the back of the neck from ear to ear. Now, the apparent discrepancy between these two descriptions can be explained. It's well known that if a pathologist comes back to see a body a day or so after the first post-mortem, you often see far more on the skin than you did the first time. The sort of bruising comes out, as we say colloquially, and marks appear much more evident. So you can't blame Professor Cameron for having a much lesser description, because Spann saw it at an advantage of a later date.
In typical cases of hanging from a high suspension point, the rope or flex used rises to a peak where the knot is tied. This leaves a mark consisting of 2 bruises with a gap below the knot. However, in cases of strangulation, a complete linear bruise appears around the neck. This was the kind of bruise found on Hess by Professor Spann at his examination.
Aus den Fotografien geht hervor, dass sie sich
You can see from these photographs that this was clearly not a case of typical hanging.
die Fotografie vom Nacken,
There is a horizontal mark on the neck without any tendency to peak.
ohne jede Tendenz nach oben.
Most importantly, the line is totally unbroken. This proves that a strangulation device must have been applied.
The first thing is that the data is pretty insufficient to come to any firm conclusion, but I see no reason whatsoever to deny that this was a hanging. The theory of Professor Spann that because the mark was horizontal, it must be strangulation is just not true. And textbooks will show many pictures of exactly similar cases. I was involved in a case some time ago in which the same situation occurred. There's a picture of the mark around the back of the neck, horizontal. You can see it on the front of the neck, horizontal. And yet, as far as I'm concerned, the explanation was reconstructed in these experiments with the dummy, where the woman was found in that position, a relatively low suspension point, the body leaning away and the rope going down obliquely. So you end up, again, with a horizontal mark around the neck. There's no problem in believing that. So I just don't accept that explanation, Professor Spann. He may be right. I can't say he's not right. But you can't say this must be the explanation. You can say this could be the explanation. So it's open.
But for Hugh Thomas, the post-mortem also provided clear proof that the prisoner in Spandau had never been shot in the chest. Professor Knight accepts that neither autopsy makes any reference to gunshot wounds.
Professor Cameron confines himself to saying that there was an old scar on the left side of the chest, and he gives its position but not its size. Whereas Professor Spann is more expansive, and he says there are 2 small scars on the chest with surgical stitching adjacent. Now, I think these must be from the suicide gesture which Hess made in Abergavenny during the war, where he put a knife through a fold of skin. They certainly don't give any indication of being a gunshot wound. So this is another problem, that there is no mention at all in either post-mortem report of anything which, to me, would indicate an old through-and-through rifle injury from 1917.
So while the cause of death could have been suicide, both autopsies seem to favour Hugh Thomas's theory about the dead man's identity.
Whatever attempts are made now to actually belittle the extent of the evidence, it's total. The man wasn't shot. The man wasn't Hess. Why, therefore, was anyone murdered? Very obviously, because he wasn't Hess. That's a somewhat simplistic view from maybe a simple or cynical surgeon. But I only deal in facts.
Hugh Thomas had seen no wounds on Hess, but the record showed clearly that Hess had been shot through the lung. So what kind of wounds should Hess have had?
I'd expected to see very considerable evidence, an obvious frontal wound, an exit wound, and an operative scar of some considerable dimensions. I also expected to see the exit wound, at least, grossly disfigured because of the fact in those days they didn't have antibiotics. I expected to see an ugly thoracotomy wound because, again, antibiotics would have left a considerable depression and an ugly scar, or the lack of antibiotics. I saw none of this.
Hugh Thomas was working from records found in Berlin, but the reference to Munich on this page of the medical document printed in Thomas's own book clearly indicates the location of Hess's original hospital records. In these archives in Munich are kept the medical records of every Bavarian soldier who fought in the First World War. We asked Dr. Ulrich Lappenkooper of Bonn to follow up the obvious lead in Thomas's book. Among these files were the original hospital records of infantryman Rudolf Hess.
Zunächst einmal handelt es sich bei dieser Kriegsrangliste ein Dokument, das nicht sehr viel Aufschluss gibt.
This new evidence shows that suggestions that Hess ever had scars of the size described by Hugh Thomas were never more than sheer speculation. For Bernard Knight, the discovery was significant.
Dr. Lappenkooper has found conclusive evidence of a gunshot wound, through and through gunshot wound of the chest, sustained in 1917. The records show that there's a pea-sized entrance wound on the front, about 3 fingers above the armpit fold, and an exit wound, again pea-size, on the back near the shoulder blade. Now, these are very small indeed. Pea-size is about 1 centimetre, and the fibrosing process that always occurs in scars after 70 years would shrink those down to almost nothing, and skin diseases or little scratches could account for the same sort of injury. And I wouldn't blame any forensic pathologist for not noting those at a post-mortem.
So, careful analysis demonstrates that all the main elements in Hugh Thomas's conspiracy theory of Hess's life and death have major flaws. The plane in which Hess left Germany was the plane which landed in Scotland. The prisoner in Spandau could have committed suicide and almost certainly did. The medical records, voice and visual analysis, the evidence of the family, all indicate that the Führer's deputy and the prisoner in Spandau were one and the same. Hess, in other words, was Hess. Conspiracy theories are much more exciting than common sense. That's one of the secrets of their success. They survive largely because of the difficulty, not to mention the tedium, of trying to prove an opposite, a negative. It's really not very likely either that the CIA murdered President Kennedy or that the Mafia disposed of Marilyn Monroe. But obtaining absolute proof that either of those theories is wrong is really rather difficult. In the case of the Hess conspiracy theory, however, my own feeling is that for once it is just about possible to prove a negative. So, instead of the enormously complex theory of the switch of a bogus Hess for the real Hess in 1941 and his murder in 1987, we're left with a simpler but still remarkable tale of a thoroughly unpleasant leading Nazi who had a brainstorm in 1941, flew on a mission impossible to Scotland, was tried as a war criminal at Nuremberg, spent the rest of his life at Spandau, and finally committed suicide at the age of 93.
Die Partei